Thank you, Mr. Robert. XY, seems like you have some follow-up question. Please go ahead.
No, I just get my endorsement. Let's take more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Robert, one quick uh, comment on Islamophobia bill. Can you a little bit elaborate on that? Because seems like it's not just within the boundaries of U.S., but also it is gonna create some committee which is gonna uh, kind of monitor how the other states are doing. But there is less clarity. What is Islamophobia bill? Does it stops you to talk about Islam? Does it stops any kind of discussion like which right now we are discussing? Is it unlawful? Can you a little bit talk about what does this mean by having this Islamophobia bill? Really appreciate your uh, comment on that.
Certainly. The Islamophobia bill strikingly contains no definition of Islamophobia, and that is a calculated action by Representative Ilhan Omar, the Muslim representative from Minnesota, who is one of the sponsors of the bill. Islamophobia is intentionally left undefined because the word is often used for two distinct phenomena that are not actually necessarily related at all. One is the vigilante attacks against innocent Muslims. Those are never justified under any circumstances, and they are already covered by existing laws against assault and so on. Nonetheless, if one is speaking about that as Islamophobia, there's no tremendous objection. However, the word Islamophobia is also used to cover any discussion of the motivating ideology of jihad terrorism. And anyone who speaks about Islam's teachings regarding jihad, such as we are doing here today, would be Islamophobic. Now, this is the insidious aspect of the whole concept of Islamophobia, that people support it because they think they are supporting efforts against vigilante attacks. And that's all fine. There's no objection to that whatsoever. But they end up supporting an inhibition of honest analysis of what motivates jihad activity. And that does seem to be what the agenda really is here. Now, as far as the international aspect of it goes, that's actually the only thing that the bill is supposed to do. It is supposed to create within the State Department an international observatory which will search for Islamophobic activity worldwide and supposedly rebuke those who engage in it. And so I think that is something that is likely to create friction between the United States and various other governments, likely also the government of India, in the future. The idea of it being used domestically is actually not covered in this bill, but it's certain that if this bill passes, which it almost certainly will, then it will be used to silence domestic critics of jihad violence and Sharia oppression, as well as to track it internationally.
So, sir, just follow up question. So, is it okay to discuss Hindu religion? Is it okay to discuss Christian religion, Jews, any all other religion? But it is not allowed to discuss Islam. Isn't it very biased and bigoted approach to uh, really limit the discussion, any free speech about particular religion? Is it not gonna encourage more people to go in the direction they have been already kind of trained and educated and be more Islamic uh, in the aggression nature perspective? Uh, is anyone raising such issues? Even UNGA also passed this bill, Islamophobia, I think in last session. So, is it also supported from other European countries as well? What's your thought on that?
Yes, many of the European countries already have this kind of measure in place So it's very much supported by them. And nobody is raising the question that you just raised in regard to it being only directed toward criticism of Islam, whereas criticism of Hinduism, of Christianity, of Buddhism, of Judaism, that's all fine. The equation that is made is with anti-Semitism, and which is not really criticism of Judaism at all, but the conspiracy theories and other things that identify Jews as being somehow secretly running the world and secretly responsible for various kinds of evils. That kind of thing, there's already an observatory at the State Department that covers it. Now, what Ilhan Omar and her allies have done is claim that Muslims are uniquely victimized and uniquely singled out for harassment and discrimination worldwide. Now, this is obviously not the case. There is no justification for thinking that Muslims are uniquely victimized in the world today. There's a great deal of persecution of Christians in Pakistan and in Africa in various places. There is, of course, terrible discrimination and persecution of the Hindus in Pakistan and Bangladesh, those who remain there. But there is not large-scale persecution of Muslims anywhere. And yet, on the basis of these false claims, Ilhan Omar and her allies have been able to prevail upon the U.S. House. Of course, it's because her party is in power there. She was able to prevail upon the U.S. House to adopt this provision because of the claim that it is needed in light of the large-scale victimization of Muslims. It's all based on fiction and fantasy and wild exaggeration. But that's what carried the day in this case, and will likely get it passed in the Senate and signed by the president as well.
Thank you. Let's take a few more questions. We will go to Endik. Endik, please ask your question. Please keep it brief.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the mic. Robert, sir, it's an honor to be able to ask a question to you. My
Thank you.
question deals with what you mentioned, the appeasement of the radical Islamic community. We see that it is not a hidden fact that the left and even the ultra left goes to unknown extents to cover and shield these people. For example, when the government of India introduced CA, the left and ultra left were busy romanticizing a utopian world through poetry. When a certain politician by the name of Geert Wilders of the Netherlands calls out this hypocrisy and calls out the appeasing habit of the left, these people attack him, and he does not get the right number of votes to, stay in power. So my question to you, sir, is just taking these two, three things as example. What needs to be done to counter the left peacefully, legally? I don't mean to harm them, but peacefully, intellectually, and legally. How can we counter the left, sir?
Thank you. In the first place, the alliance, it needs to be understood, is based on the fact that both Islam and the left are authoritarians. They are not interested in democracy. They're not interested in free inquiry. They're not interested in a republic. They want to crush their enemies and silence dissent. The left always does this whenever it takes power. Anywhere in the world, whenever the far left takes power, it's a reign of terror. In the same way, whenever Islam takes power, there's a reign of terror. It's a different kind of reign of terror under Sharia. The amputations, the stonings, all the rest of it that make people too afraid to get out of line, in the same way as they are in a communist state. So the left and Islam make common cause because they are both authoritarians, both totalitarians for that matter. Now, what can be done is we can play up the hypocrisy of the alliance, because even though they do have this shared authoritarianism, at the same time, there are many superficial differences. The sexual libertinism of the left versus the emphasis on modesty, although there's a great deal, of course, that is spurious about that. Nonetheless, the claim that the left supports women's rights and so on, and the misogyny of Islam, these are all pressure points that can and should be drawn attention to wherever and whenever possible, and exploited in order to show that the alliance is something that is not beneficial for any group, for either group or for people at large. For the most part, of course, the establishment media ignores the cracks and fissures in this alliance because they're part of it as well.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. Let's take another question. I would like to go to Abhinav. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Gupta sir. Thank you, Robert sir, for joining us. Sir, my question is, as we know that Pakistan is the motherland of terrorism, and their policy is to exploit the state and media in order to achieve maximum attainable publicity as an amplifying force in order to influence the target. It can be reach short or mid-term political goals or desired long-term end states. Sir, my question is, why is terrorism so frequently associated with Islam? Because of Quran, Mullah, and Madrasa. And my second question is that we know that United Nations has passed a resolution for Islamophobia. Does it give freedom to terrorists or protect their activities?
Yes, in the first place, terrorism is so frequently associated with Islam because it's taught in the Quran. And in the example of Muhammad as he is described in the Islamic texts, the Quran says in chapter 3, verse 151, Allah says he will strike terror in the unbelievers. This is repeated in chapter 8, verse 12, where he instructs the angels to strike off the heads and the fingertips of the unbelievers. Then in chapter 8, verse 60 of the Quran, Allah tells the believers themselves to strike terror in the enemies of Allah. Now, the terror, of course, takes the form of violence and killing. There are several exhortations to kill the infidels. This is in chapter 2, verse 191, and chapter 4, verse 89. Kill them wherever you find them. This is echoed also in chapter 9, verse 5, which says, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. Chapter 9, verse 29 says to fight against even the people of the book, which would be Jews and Christians primarily, until they submit, pay the jizya, the tax, and submit to the hegemony of Islam. Chapter 47, verse 4 says, when you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks, that is, behead them, and so on. So there is no other religion that has texts like this in its scriptures. And so it's no wonder, really, it's no surprise at all that so many Muslims are violent and so many become terrorists, because they believe that in doing so, they are serving Allah and pleasing Allah. Muhammad himself behaved in the same way in the Islamic traditions about him. And so, as Muslims imitate his example, which they are also told to do in the Quran in chapter 33, verse 21, then they tend to become violent and become terrorists. So, the UN's Islamophobia bill, will it give a cover to terrorists? Certainly, there's no doubt about that, because people will be afraid to speak about the motivating ideology of jihad terrorism, because they'll be afraid that they will be accused of being Islamophobic. And as there get to be civil and criminal penalties for being Islamophobic, there will be fewer and fewer people who will dare to discuss these issues honestly. And this, of course, will give the jihadis cover to do whatever they wish, knowing that few people will have the courage to stand up to them and point out what they're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. Let's take a question from Rakesh, Mr. Rakesh Ved.
Good evening, Robert, and good evening, everybody else on this forum right now. Mr. Robert, I just finished your book, Stealth Jihad. Um, well, very interesting book. But I have some apprehensions that I want you to answer, if possible. There is an organization called the Organization of Islamic Countries. When they sit together, they talk of the atrocities, you know, inverted commas, whether they are committed or not on the Muslim world. They are very specific, very focused on few countries. They are not discussing what's happening in Somalia, Sudan. They are very centric to Kashmir and Palestine. They are very centric to the Western power. So I'm looking at the possible scenario. Do you think the way they have a OIC, do you see in the times to come world vertically splitting down? There are two blocks, a Muslim bloc and a non-Muslim bloc. Do you see any possibility? Because now what is we see right now is a political Islam. It has nothing to do with the spiritual Islam. So political Islam being dominant, do you see anywhere down the line, 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years down the line, world splitting vertically into two factions, Muslim and non-Muslims? Thank you very much.
The split between Muslims and non-Muslims is envisioned in Islamic theology and has been for 1400 years. The Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, is commanded to wage perpetual war against the Dar al-Harb, the House of War, which is the entire non-Muslim world. So the split is already there and is envisioned by any knowledgeable and believing Muslim. Now, in the future, there will continue to be jihad activity because it's taught in the Quran and taught in the Sunnah, the traditions of Muhammad that are normative for Islamic law. So, will the split become more evident in the world in the future? It is likely that that's true, that will happen. And will it lead to a greater awareness among non-Muslims of this? Yeah, I think that there is a general tendency among non-Muslims, particularly in the West, but also I believe in India as well. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but people tend to think that even if there was jihad activity in the past, it's the province of a tiny minority of extremists, and for the most part, Muslims are ready to join the secular liberal world order and should be welcomed as such. And that this assumption is false and will be harder and harder to sustain in the face of ongoing jihad activity.
My just one follow-up question,
Sir
Robert.
Rakesh, sir, please, please,
One follow-up question,
sir, there are so many questions. I really request you to please hold on, and if time allows, we will definitely come to you. My apologies, sincere apologies. Let's go to Mr. Liberal. Liberal, please go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Taji. And it's illiberal actually. So, yeah, Dr. Spencer, very good morning to you, and what an honor to have put up a question for you, Dr. Spencer. I would like to ask you a question, with particular reference to your book, The History of Jihad, from Muhammad to ISIS. On page 286, you talk about JKLF, and you say that this is a secular organization. My first question is because this is quite intriguing to me that you brand JKLF as secular. I would like to very much understand how did you come to that conclusion? How come JKLF, which was established, which was founded by Maqbul Bhatt, who was a terrorist who was ultimately hanged, how did you come to this conclusion that JKLF is a secular organization, number one? Number two, you have completely missed out the exodus of hundreds of thousands of Kashmiri Hindus from your chapter on partition of India. It says the partition of India, and Jihad and Partition of India. That's the title of that chapter. And the killing of more than 15 to 20,000 Kashmiri Hindus who were raped and killed and murdered in cold blood by the same JKLF organization. So these 2 points, I mean, it's quite intriguing to me that it's been totally missed out. And was that on purpose, or was just that you didn't wish to write on that issue? So could you kindly answer that, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Lilibrat. Back to you, Mr. Robert. Mr. Robert Spencer, seems like you are not. You have not unmuted. Uh, we cannot hear you.
Was I audible?
I think you was
I think you
audible.
was audible.
I was
Okay.
audible. Okay. Yeah.
Liberal, can you keep yourself muted because there is echo coming? I'm reaching out to Mr. Robert. Seems like he has some network issue. We cannot hear him.
No problem. I will repeat my question once we
No, no,
finish.
no.
So,
Question.
No, question.
Sir, your question is audible. I have to take away speaker from you because there is a lot of echo from your end. Your question is clear. I will repeat if needed. My
Can you hear me
apologies.
now?
Yes, we can hear you, Mr.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I heard the question. There's no need to repeat it. As I was trying to explain, actually, I didn't realize I wasn't on. I was muted. The identification of JKLF as secular actually is in the book in a quotation, so it's not my assessment. I was relying upon a historian of Kashmir, Talat Bhat, and so you will find that identification as secular is in his quotation. I didn't actually choose the quotation because he identified it as secular, but because he provided a useful summary of the relevant events. And so, in any case, I'm sorry, there are always some errors in these things, and I'll see if I can correct that in the future printings. But no, I didn't intentionally leave out the genocide in Kashmir, not at all. Unfortunately, I was constrained by space, and so I wasn't able to cover everything. The book has a very large scope because it doesn't just cover the jihad in India, but the jihad in Europe and elsewhere. And I can tell you that for 4 years now, since it was published, I've been getting questions of why did you leave this out or why did you leave that out? And so maybe another volume is in order. I'll have to look into that. I don't know if that's possible.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. We had 1 hour of your time, sir, which we have almost consumed. Is it okay if we can take a couple of more questions, Mr. Robert?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you so much. Let's go to Mr. Jay, and then we will go to XYZ. Mr. Dr. Jay.
Thank you very much, Guptaji, for organizing this space. This was very important for me. I've been waiting for this because you sent me the notification that Robert was coming, and since I watched Robert's few YouTube videos and where he was so passionate about investigating and analyzing the impact of this religion on the society and on humanity as a whole. So I think today I'm taking this opportunity to ask a few questions. I think 57 countries are there who are adopting this religion, and they all are men dominating, and women, I think, don't have that much say. Maybe half the value of the men's. I think they all are deprived by the men dominating society. I would like to know what sort of thrill the men take out of slaving or enslaving the women and also killing other people. I think did your book cover this aspect, psychological aspect, how the man get thrill out of either enslaving women or behaving the way they want them to behave according to their wish, maybe in terms of sex or when dealing with the kafir in terms of killing. I think there must be thorough investigation, how this religion is perpetuating all these two sides of thrills, and whether there is some solution, whether this can be taken to UN or some agency must be involved. How this book is damaging the society and humanity as a whole, because a lot of crimes are going on just because of this, and
Thank,
especially women are the major victim. Thank you, please.
thank you, Dr. J.
In the first place, the UN doesn't care. You're not going to get any satisfaction from the UN. The UN is largely under the control of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It's the largest voting bloc at the UN, and so if there's something that the Muslim countries find offensive, it's not going to get any traction at the UN. As far as the psychological aspect goes, I'm no psychologist, but I think it's very clear that a religion that is preaching the dominance of the Muslim male and the necessity of women and non-Muslims to submit to the hegemony of the Muslim male, that is very attractive to certain kinds of personality. But in any case, there's no doubt that this dominance is preached, and whatever thrill a Muslim may get or may not get from it, it is the law of Allah. And so as far as the Muslim male is concerned, it's simply the will of Allah, the supreme being, to force women and non-Muslims to submit. It's just the natural order of things that must be followed, and consequently it is not to be questioned.
Yeah,
Thank you, Dr. Robert. To add to that, Robert, recently I hope I am quoting correctly, there is one report from BBC in which they have mentioned, and it is also a lot of in news on a regular basis, just 2-3 days back, one girl has been killed because she refused to convert to Islam and married to a man. There are so many reports in Pakistan where minor Hindu girls, Sikh girls, are being forcefully converted to Islam and get married to much older guys. And it is happening consistently every year. In that report, it says the number varies from 1,000 to 6,000. Uh, uh, the human rights organizations are completely quiet on that, and these girls are aging from many of them are in the age of 10 to 14. uh, why this world organizations are quiet on that, including the UN? Can you please comment on that?
Yes, it's actually just what I noted a moment ago. The UN is under the control, for the most part, of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And so you can see that in the passage of the Islamophobia resolution that Imran Khan sponsored at the UN or advocated at the UN. It was because of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that this was approved. And so you mentioned Pooja Kumari, the Hindu girl who was murdered because she was resisting being kidnapped and forcibly converted and married in Pakistan, and that she's just one of many. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation prevents the UN and prevents other organizations in around the world from paying proper attention to that, because to do so would be Islamophobic.
Definitely. Thank you, Mr. Robert. We will take one more question from XYZ and Indic. Please go ahead, XYZ.
Yes, thank you, sir. My question is for the Western population to have emancipated the likes of rational legal authority and by Max Weber and logical positivism by Russell and Wittgenstein. So these kind of thoughts, they have been able to emancipate for last 200. What do you think? Like they were the same thought process. They are being trapped by ambiguous term like Islamophobia. because if we understand the epistemology from their epistemology, there is nothing like a unanimity of what is Islam. I mean, we see that there are factions within Islam, hundreds of factions fighting for the right Islam. So, and I think most of the killings, most of the phobia is within the Islamic factionalism. I mean, they don't agree with the concept of Allah, they don't agree with the concept of Nabi or even Kalma, right? I mean, their basic the declaration of faith. So I would say, like, because in India, the most genocide that has happened is in India with the Hindus, and there should be a Hindu phobia in the United States, in the United Nations. I mean, would you agree that because in the textbook, Western narrative textbook, we all have been taught that Jews have undergone the most number of genocide, but there is no mention for the Hindu genocide that has happened. I think it's easily rovers around 200 to 400 million people just by the population statistics number from 11th century to the 16th century. So, would you agree and to this endorse to this view that Hindus have undergone the maximum genocide in the world? Thank you.
Certainly, the Islamic Jihad against India was the most virulent, most violent, the bloodiest of all the jihads worldwide. And, excuse me, the death count is in the tens of millions and far outstrips any other uh, similar action anywhere. And so, yes, absolutely. But the United States, the United Nations, they're not going to deal with this issue because, or they're not going to speak about Hindu phobia because there's just no similar voting bloc like the OIC at the UN. And so to speak about these things would be to transgress against the dominant narrative. And the dominant narrative is controlled by the OIC and formulated by the OIC and similar groups. So there's no chance of that because there's no voting power that's similar to that of the OIC.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. Robert, we will take two more questions. Thanks for being flexible and accommodative. One we will take from Professor Jagdish. Please go ahead.
Robert, you have spoken in great detail. What I'm understanding that in international politics, quite often we come across hypocrisy, and that is very common in international relations. When West or America attacks Muslim world, they do carpet bombing and kills almost everybody on that particular site. But when anybody in India touches a single face of a minority, they call it a minority, although sorry, Robert, your microphone is on. So whenever anything happens in country like India or elsewhere, then suddenly the same American groups or American think tanks or American Washington Post or New York Times, they start making huge noise that in India minority is in trouble, they are facing problems. So can you tell me that this hypocrisy is different from that UN block of OIC voting en masse for one object? Thank you.
It's all the same hypocrisy. And you have to understand that the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on, these are not news organizations. These are propaganda organs for the same entities that are enforcing this hypocrisy. And the contradiction is left open and unaddressed. The United States bombed a family in Afghanistan as the American forces were withdrawing and claimed that it was ISIS, the ISIS leader in Afghanistan. It turned out to be just an ordinary family, and nothing happens because who's going to hold them accountable? The same corrupt officials that were behind the strike exonerate themselves, and everything goes on as before. As long as these people are in power internationally, that hypocrisy will continue. And so what we need to do is focus on using every possible legal and peaceful means to get them out of power. And the more we succeed in that internationally, the more this hypocrisy will come to an end.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. We will just take last question from Indik. Please, Indik, go ahead.
Right, right.
Keep the question brief, please, short.
Sure, sure. So it's a very small question for Mr. Robert, sir. So it is, what is your assessment of why Mr. Gert Wilders, who I think is also a friend of yours, is not winning in the Netherlands? And do you see him winning to become the prime minister in the future?
I certainly hope he becomes prime minister, but I must say, I don't think he ever will, unless there's a huge change in the political culture there. The reason why I say this is that Geert Wilders represents a way of thinking that is completely opposed to the political establishment in the Netherlands and all over Europe and all over the West. So the entire political establishment in the Netherlands has united against him. There's not a single party, and Netherlands is a multi-party state. And so because there's not a single party that will ally with him, he can never achieve the sufficient number of seats in the House, the Parliament, in order to gain the prime ministership. If there were any party of any significant size that was willing to enter into a coalition with him, he could become prime minister. But they have foreclosed on that possibility. They have made that, they've ruled that out a priori. It's every party against him, because they all represent the same establishment. It's the same thing in the United States. We have the Republicans and the Democrats, but they're really all the same thing. And they are just two factions of one large establishment party that is in control. Trump represented an alternative to both of them. And this is one of the reasons why they had to destroy him.
Right, right. That makes sense,
Thank
sir.
you.
And please give my regards to Mr. Geert Wilders, sir. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Robert. Thank you so much for your time. It was really pleasure hosting you. There are a lot of requests below, more than 2025. My apologies, sir. I cannot. Everyone who waited for request for the speaker, I couldn't give a speaker to everybody. My sincere apologies. I will maybe reach out to Mr. Robert to join us again. And I know there are a lot of questions, there are a lot more things to cover. But he had a very busy schedule today, and we are really obliged that he could find some time from his busy schedule to join us and share his thoughts. So I promise that I will continue to be in touch with him, and then we will try to uh, request him to come again and join us. And I will try that many of whose questions we couldn't take, we can try to get those answers in the next session. So again, Mr. Robert Spencer, thank you so much for your time. Would you like to make some closing comments, sir?
Just that things are going to be very difficult, and I hope you will all have courage and continue and hold to your convictions. There will be tremendous pressure upon us to discard them and to embrace the official lies, and we have to stand strong. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. I think we will continue to have this space and discuss other things which we couldn't cover. And again, it was